Every man who has ever built anything of lasting value built it during a period when he felt wholly insufficient to the building of it. That is not an observation. That is the finding of 20 years of research conducted across 500 cases in the parlors and offices and private studies of the wealthiest and most accomplished men this nation has produced. It is a law operating as reliably as the law of gravity, and it has been operating in your life whether you have been aware of it or not. The man who waits until he feels strong before he acts will wait forever. The man who acts in spite of weakness, who learns to turn the very feeling of insufficiency into the raw material from which discipline is forged, that man will build whatever he has decided to build, and he will build it with a certainty that the comfortable man, the man who requires favorable conditions before he begins, can never possess. Remember this. Weakness is not the opposite of discipline. It is its raw material. Consider for a moment the price that has been paid by the millions who never learned this. I do not use the word millions carelessly. In 46 years of studying human achievement and its opposite, I have observed that the majority, not a minority, the overwhelming majority of men and women who possess the intelligence, the talent, and the opportunity to build a life of genuine opulence and purpose fail to do so for one reason and one reason alone. They confuse the feeling of weakness with the verdict of incapacity. They stand at the base of the required action, feel the resistance of it, and conclude from that feeling that they are not the kind of person who can perform it. They do not say this aloud. They do not say it consciously. But in the silent courtroom of the subconscious mind, they enter a verdict, insufficient. And the subconscious, which does not question the verdicts handed to it, but only acts upon them, organizes their subsequent behavior to confirm it. This is the cost. Not dramatic failure, not visible collapse. The quiet, gradual, invisible cost of the action never taken, the account never opened, the practice never established. The man at 50 who cannot identify the precise morning on which he decided not to begin, because he never consciously decided, he simply waited, and the waiting became permanent. You may at this very moment be paying that cost. I want you to ask yourself a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, without the softening that the ego applies to such questions when it is uncomfortable. When was the last time you felt weak in the face of a required action, genuinely weak, not as an excuse, but as a real condition of your state in that moment, and chose not to begin? Hold that moment in your mind. We will return to it. In the winter of 1919, I was introduced to a man named Warren Aldrich, a 29-year-old typewriter repairman in Cleveland, Ohio, who had spent 3 years attempting to establish a morning reading practice that he believed, with full conviction, would change the direction of his life. He was not wrong in that belief. He had identified a definite major purpose: to educate himself sufficiently to enter the field of commercial law, which was then expanding rapidly in the industrial Midwest. He had identified the specific reading required. He had identified the specific hour, 5 in the morning, before the demands of his trade consumed him. And he had written the commitment down in the precise manner I had been teaching since my earliest lectures. He had failed to keep it on 219 consecutive mornings. Not mornings on which he had been ill, or called away by genuine emergency, or prevented by forces outside his control. Mornings on which he had felt weak. Mornings on which the warmth of his bed and the reasonable voice of insufficient preparation had argued against beginning, and he had listened. When I sat with Aldrich in January of 1919, I asked him one question. I said, "What exactly are you waiting to feel before you begin?" He said, after a pause of some seconds, "Capable." I said, "Capable of what precisely?" He said, "Capable of the hour, capable of sustaining the attention the reading requires." I told him that he had stated with great precision the nature of his difficulty. And then I told him something that I want you to hear as though it is being said to you directly, because it is being said to you directly. The capacity he was waiting to feel was not going to arrive before the practice. It was going to be built by the practice. He was waiting, in other words, for the consequence of the action to precede the action. He was waiting for the harvest before he had planted the seed. And here is where I stopped, and told him nothing further that morning. I told him to return in 90 days. I will tell you what he found when he returned, but not yet. Now I want to give you the mechanism. Because the story of Ulrich is not useful to you unless you understand why it works, the precise machinery behind the law, the way the subconscious receives an instruction and what it does with that instruction once it has been received. Thoughts are things. I have been saying this for 40 years, and I will continue saying it because it is the most consequential truth available to any man who intends to direct his own life. The thought of incapacity, held consistently in the mind and confirmed by the behavior that follows from it, is not an abstract feeling. It is an instruction delivered to the most powerful instrument in the human body, the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind, which does not reason, which does not evaluate, which does not ask whether the instruction is accurate or deserved or fair, executes it with perfect efficiency. Here is the law stated in terms precise enough to apply. The law of habit automation operates as follows. Every action performed by a human being exists initially in a state of high resistance, what I have termed the first stage, in which the action requires significant and conscious will to initiate. When the action is performed consistently, despite the resistance of the first stage, the subconscious mind begins a process I will call automation, the gradual absorption of the action into the pattern of behavior that requires no conscious initiation. The action moves from the first stage to what I term the second stage, in which it is habitual but still attended to, and finally to the third stage, in which it is automatic, occurring as naturally as the regulation of breath. The critical fact is this. The movement from the first stage to the second requires one thing and one thing only, not readiness, not favorable conditions, not the arrival of sufficient motivation or confidence or capacity. Repetition. Consistent repetition in the presence of resistance across sufficient time for the subconscious to absorb the action as pattern. I want to be precise about what sufficient time means, because the average man, hearing this principle, imagines that the movement from the first stage to the second will require years of sustained effort before any relief is felt. That imagination has discouraged more men from beginning than any other single misconception I have encountered in 46 years of research. The truth is considerably more encouraging, though I caution you against receiving it as permission to expect rapid transformation. In my research, I found that the measurable diminishment of first-stage resistance, the point at which the beginning of the required action becomes noticeably less difficult than it was on the first day, occurs in the majority of cases between the 14th and the 21st repetition. Not the 21st day necessarily, the 21st repetition. For the man who performs the minimum viable beginning daily, this means somewhere between the second and third week, the subconscious has accumulated sufficient evidence of the pattern to begin reducing the resistance at the moment of initiation. This is the law of accumulation operating in the specific domain of character development. Every repetition deposits an increment. The increments are invisible individually. They produce no perceptible change on the first day or the 5th or sometimes the 10th. But they accumulate with the precision of arithmetic, and at a certain threshold, which varies by individual and by the nature of the practice, but which my research places consistently in the range I have described, the threshold is crossed, and the subconscious delivers the first perceptible reduction in resistance. This is not the completion of the building. It is the first evidence that the building is in progress, and it is available to any man who performs the minimum viable beginning consistently enough to reach it. Mr. Carnegie observed this law operating in the development of his organization with a precision that I found remarkable when he described it to me. He said that every new enterprise he undertook exhibited the same pattern, a period of apparently fruitless effort followed by a point of inflection, beyond which the same effort produced compounding returns. He called this inflection point the threshold of pattern acceptance, the moment at which the subconscious, individual or collective, accepts the new behavior as the expected state rather than the aberrant one. His observation in the domain of enterprise organization mirrors precisely what I observed in the domain of individual character development. The law is the same. The threshold is real. The accumulation is arithmetic. and the man who acts consistently will reach the threshold regardless of whether he can feel the accumulation happening. The man who acts consistently in weakness does not remain in weakness. He moves through it via the mechanism of repetition and the law of accumulation to a state in which the action no longer demands the will it once demanded. The weakness is consumed by the repetition. It does not vanish. It is absorbed. It becomes ordinary. And ordinary things do not feel weak to do. This is the machinery. The question is why the majority never engages it. The answer to that question is the subject of the next several minutes of your attention. Consider the case of Leonard Marsh, 34 years of age, a hardware merchant in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who came to one of my lectures in the autumn of 1923. Marsh had read Think and Grow Rich in manuscript. He had attended 3 of my lectures before that autumn. He had, by his own accounting, the clearest theoretical understanding of the principles of success of any man in his circle of acquaintance. He could recite the 17 principles of achievement in the correct order. He had done so at the dinner table often enough that his wife had asked him with some exasperation to stop. He had never applied them. Not because he did not want to. The burning desire was genuine. He wanted, with something approaching desperation, to build a life beyond the hardware merchant's trade. He had identified a definite major purpose, to establish an importing business in the newly expanding post-war markets. He had made the decision, consciously and sincerely, on no fewer than 9 separate occasions over 3 years. Each time he had felt weak when the moment of action arrived. And here is precisely where he failed. Not in the moment of weakness itself, but in what he concluded from that moment. Marsh concluded, each time he felt the resistance of the first stage, that the resistance was evidence of something wrong with him fundamentally. He was not, he told himself, the kind of man who could sustain the required discipline. Other men had built what he wanted to build. He had studied them carefully. He could see, with clarity, the gap between what they were and what he was. And each time he felt that gap widened by the fresh evidence of another morning's failure to begin, he retreated further from the action. At the age of 41, when I last heard of Leonard Marsh, he was still in the hardware merchant's trade. He had, by that point, stopped attending lectures. He had concluded, not without evidence, given the record he had accumulated, that the principles worked for other men, men of a different kind. He was 3 feet from gold. He had been 3 feet from gold for the better part of a decade, and he spent those years walking away from it, turning the evidence of temporary resistance into the permanent verdict of incapacity. Here is a truth about Leonard Marsh that he could not see from inside his own experience. He was not different in kind from the men who had built what he wanted to build. He was different only in his response to the feeling of weakness. He treated it as a verdict. They treated it as weather. Weather passes. Verdicts endure. Leonard Marsh chose the verdict, and the verdict endured. Now I want to name the specific fear that is operating in you right now. Because there is a fear operating. There is always a fear operating. And in my research, I identified 6 basic fears that account for the paralyzing majority of human failures. The fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of the loss of love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death. The fear operating in the viewer who feels weak when discipline is required is, in virtually every case I have studied, the fear of criticism. Not from others, though that is present, but from the self. The specific, devastating, constantly available criticism of the man who has tried and not succeeded, turned inward, applied with a precision and a cruelty that no external critic could match. When you feel weak and do not act, you are protecting yourself from the evidence that you acted and still did not sustain it. You are protecting yourself from the moment when you begin and then stop, which feels worse, feels more damning than never having begun at all. I want to examine this protection mechanism with more precision, because it is the specific mechanism that has kept Leonard Marsh in the hardware trade and kept men like him in their equivalent trades for the full duration of their capable years. The internal critic, the voice of self-directed fear of criticism, operates on a peculiar logic that I want to name clearly so that you may recognize it when it operates in you. The logic is this: if I have not yet truly tried, If I have only gestured at beginning, only circled the action, only maintained the intention without the act, then the full evidence of my incapacity is not yet on the record. The full verdict is not yet delivered. There is still, in the absence of a genuine, sustained attempt, the theoretical possibility that I am capable. That possibility, however diminished by years of non-beginning, is more comfortable than the confirmed verdict that a genuine attempt followed by failure would produce. This is magical thinking dressed in the language of caution, and it is costing you, every day that it operates, the increments of accumulation that the law of accumulation would otherwise be depositing on your behalf. The man who has genuinely tried and failed to sustain is further along the automation process than the man who has never tried. He has deposited increments. He has moved the needle, however slightly, toward the threshold of pattern acceptance. He carries the evidence of his attempting in the subconscious record even when he cannot perceive it consciously. The man who protects himself from the evidence of failure by never genuinely attempting has deposited nothing. He is at the same point on the day of his 50th failed intention as he was on the day of his first. The fear of criticism does not protect you from failure. It guarantees it by preventing the accumulation that would eventually end it. Here is the price that fear has already charged you. Every morning you did not begin is a morning the automation did not advance. Every morning the resistance remained in the first stage is a morning it did not move toward the second. The fear of confirmation, the fear that beginning and failing again will prove, beyond any remaining hope of doubt, that you are not capable, has cost you not the risk of failure, but the certainty of the very insufficiency you feared. You have paid the price of failure without taking the risk of failure. And the tragedy of this is that the risk, properly understood, is not a risk at all, because beginning and failing to sustain, which is the thing you fear, advances you further toward discipline than not beginning ever does. Every beginning that does not sustain still moved the automation process one increment forward. Every beginning, however short, however incomplete, however embarrassing in retrospect, deposited one more repetition into the account that the subconscious draws from when it calculates whether an action is pattern or aberration. You cannot fail your way out of progress. You can only fail your way into it, one failed attempt at a time, until the attempts are no longer failing because the automation has absorbed them into pattern. The fear of criticism has hidden this from you. It has shown you only the immediate embarrassment of the beginning that does not last. It has not shown you the cumulative advance of every beginning, however imperfect. It has not shown you that the man who begins and stops and begins again is building slowly and invisibly and with the certainty of arithmetic what the man who waits for readiness never builds at all. I am showing it to you now. What you do with it is your responsibility, not mine. You have waited long enough. I want to give you now the principle, stated plainly, in the form that can be used rather than merely understood. This is the center of everything I have said and everything I am about to say. I want you to hear it as though you are hearing it for the first time, because for most people, even those who have read my work, they have heard it, but they have not heard it. Here it is. Discipline is not built from strength. It is built from the consistent refusal to let weakness be the final word. That refusal, not the feeling of strength, not the arrival of confidence, not the achievement of readiness, that specific, daily, stubborn, quiet refusal is the whole mechanism. Everything else is detail. The man who acts in weakness, consistently, builds the automation that eventually makes the action feel strong. He does not become a different kind of man. He becomes a man with a different record. And a different record means a different subconscious instruction. And a different subconscious instruction means different behavior. And different behavior is a different life. That is the law. That is the mechanism. That is the price and the product. And now I want to give you the formula. The formula for building self-discipline under weakness consists of 5 steps, to be applied in the precise order in which I am about to give them to you. Step 1. State your definite major purpose in writing in a single sentence before you attempt any act of discipline. Not a goal, Not an aspiration, a definite major purpose, specific, quantified, and dated. The purpose is the destination into which the subconscious will direct the energy that the discipline is designed to harness. Without the stated purpose, the discipline you are building has no direction into which to discharge its accumulated force. It is electricity without a circuit. It exists, but it illuminates nothing. Write the sentence tonight before you sleep. One sentence. The specific thing you intend to build. The specific date by which you intend to have built it. Read it aloud 3 times. Once is insufficient. The subconscious requires the repetition. 3 times is the minimum. Step 2. Identify the minimum viable beginning. This is the smallest version of the required discipline that still constitutes a genuine act, a real beginning, not a performance of beginning. For the morning reading practice, it may be 5 minutes. For the exercise discipline, 10 minutes. For the creative work, 1 paragraph. I give you this step not because the minimum viable beginning is the destination, but because it is the tool for crossing the greatest barrier in the development of any discipline, the threshold of beginning itself. In 20 years of research, I have found that the resistance in the first stage is almost entirely concentrated at the moment of beginning. Once begun, the continuation is substantially easier than the beginning was. The resistance retreats once the action is initiated. The minimum viable beginning is therefore not a compromise. It is a precise surgical instrument applied to the exact location of the greatest resistance. Use it without apology. Step 3. Before you begin, not after, speak the identity statement. The identity statement is a single sentence spoken aloud in the private moment before the minimum viable beginning is initiated. It is as follows. I am the kind of man who acts regardless of how he feels. You will notice that this statement is not an aspiration. It is a declaration of present fact. The subconscious mind, as I have explained, does not reason. It accepts and executes. When you declare a present fact to the subconscious, even a fact that your conscious mind does not yet fully believe, the subconscious begins to organize behavior consistent with that fact. This is the principle of autosuggestion applied directly to the discipline you are building. The declaration is the instruction. The action that follows is the confirmation. And the repetition of both, day after day, installs the identity as the operating description rather than the aspirational one. Speak it before you begin, not once, every time. Step 4. Record the act in a dedicated log within 1 minute of its completion. The record is a single factual sentence. The date, what you did, the conditions under which you did it. Here is an example. November 3rd, 1924. I felt insufficient. I began regardless. 5 minutes of the required reading. This record serves a function that I want to describe with precision because it is easy to dismiss as a minor practice, and it is not a minor practice. It is the mechanism by which the subconscious is shown the cumulative evidence of its own changing pattern. The subconscious mind is a calculating instrument. It assesses whether a behavior is pattern or aberration based on the frequency of its occurrence. The written record is not for your conscious mind. Your conscious mind already knows what you did. The record is the deliberate, systematic feeding of evidence to the subconscious about what kind of man you are becoming. Do not miss an entry. On the days of the minimum viable beginning, the entry is the most important entry in the entire log. Step 5. Engage the mastermind principle. The mastermind, that harmonious alliance of 2 or more minds in pursuit of a definite major purpose, is not a principle I invented. It is a principle I observed with remarkable consistency in every case of significant achievement I studied across 20 years. Not one of the great fortunes, not one of the great enterprises, not one of the lasting achievements of significance in my entire research was built by a single mind operating in isolation. Not one. You do not need 50 minds. You need one. One person, trusted, committed to your purpose, willing to receive your daily log entry without judgment and to hold you to the reporting of it. The existence of that person changes the internal calculus of the week morning in a way that the private commitment cannot. The private commitment can be renegotiated silently. The commitment to another mind cannot be renegotiated without cost. And it is that additional cost, slight as it appears, that represents on many mornings the precise difference between beginning and not beginning. These 5 steps, applied in sequence, constitute the complete formula. I do not offer them as suggestions. I offer them as the precise operational translation of a principle that I observed functioning identically in every successful case I studied. Deviation from the sequence weakens the formula. Application of the sequence as given produces the result. Now I want to address the objections. Because there are men sitting with this material right now who have already formed the counter-arguments, and I will not allow those arguments to stand unanswered. The first objection is this, that these principles are fine for men of certain natural advantages, intelligence, health, education, circumstance, but that they do not account for the genuine severity of some men's situations. That the man who is ill or in poverty or managing obligations that leave him no margin cannot be expected to apply a formula designed for men in more favorable conditions. I want to answer this with evidence, not with encouragement. In the winter of 1921, I corresponded with a man named Elias Guthrie, a 51-year-old coal miner in Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had spent 23 years underground. He was in partial deafness from the work. His hands, by his own description, were not reliable tools. He had 4 children still at home. He had less margin by any objective assessment than almost any man I have studied. He applied the 5 steps. He identified his definite major purpose, to write down in coherent form the knowledge he had accumulated about coal seam geology, knowledge that no university man possessed, but that he had developed over 2 decades beneath the earth. He applied the minimum viable beginning, 15 minutes each evening after the children were in bed. He kept the log. He found one man, his minister, who received his weekly entry. By 1926, Elias Guthrie had produced a 230-page manuscript that was eventually used as training material by 3 mining operations in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. He did not have favorable conditions. He had the formula. I want to add one further observation about Elias Guthrie, because it speaks directly to something I observe in almost every man who applies these principles under conditions of genuine constraint. Guthrie told me, when I corresponded with him in 1924, that the 15-minute minimum viable beginning did not feel, in the early weeks, like it was producing anything of value. He could see, at the end of a 15-minute session, only a paragraph or 2 of notes. He could not see how a paragraph or 2 of notes, repeated on a working miner's schedule, could accumulate into anything of significance. He continued anyway, not because he felt confident, because he had made the commitment to another mind, his minister, and the commitment carried enough weight to sustain the 15 minutes on the evenings when his own will was insufficient to sustain it. By the end of the 3rd month, he had accumulated 93 evenings of notes. He could see for the first time that the paragraphs had become pages, that the pages had become chapters, that the chapters were constituting something real. The accumulation had been invisible month by month and had become undeniable at the 90-day mark. This is the law of accumulation producing its delayed but arithmetic result. Conditions do not determine the outcome of this law. Consistent application does. I am aware of no exception to this finding in 20 years of research across 500 cases. The second objection is that the act of beginning when one feels weak produces inferior results, that the discipline built in weakness is somehow of lower quality than the discipline built in strength, and that it would be better to wait for conditions that permit full engagement. This objection reveals the misunderstanding I have been addressing throughout this address. There is no discipline built in strength. There is only discipline that has moved past the first stage, which is always, without exception, a stage of weakness and resistance, into the 2nd and 3rd stages, where it has become habitual and then automatic. The discipline that appears to have been built in strength was built in weakness in the first stage, on mornings that the man in question no longer remembers because the automation has absorbed them. What you call building in strength is what I call having already done the building. The building always happens in weakness, always. The only question is whether you are willing to be present for it. The third objection is the most honest, and I will give it the most direct answer. The objection is this: I have tried. I have tried sincerely and repeatedly, and it has not produced the result. To this I say, you have applied a portion of the formula under variable conditions with variable consistency and arrived at variable results. That is not failure. That is the first stage. You are in it. The question is not whether you have failed to move through it. The question is whether you are going to permit the evidence of your time in it to constitute a verdict about your capacity, as Leonard Marsh permitted it, or whether you are going to apply the formula as given, completely, sequentially, consistently, and allow the mechanism to operate. The mechanism does not fail. It has not failed in any case in my research where it was applied with the completeness and consistency the formula requires. Incomplete application produces incomplete results. Complete application produces the law's full expression. This is not encouragement. This is the finding. I want to return now to Warren Aldrich of Cleveland, Ohio, whom I left in January of 1919 with a single instruction and a request to return in 90 days. He returned in April. He had applied the formula. Imperfectly at first, the first 11 mornings had produced nothing except the record of the attempt, since he had begun and stopped within 2 minutes on 6 of those mornings and had not begun at all on 3 of them. He recorded every entry. On the morning of the 12th day, something occurred that I want you to understand as a mechanical event rather than an inspirational one. The subconscious mind, having received 11 consecutive entries of beginning, however brief, however imperfect, however far from the intended full practice, calculated that beginning was the pattern, and not beginning was the aberration. And on the 12th morning, the resistance at the moment of beginning was measurably less than it had been on the first morning. Aldrich told me he could not have explained why, on the 12th morning, beginning felt easier. He had not become a different man overnight. He had not received a surge of motivation or confidence. He had simply arrived at the desk at 5 in the morning and found, to his surprise, that the first sentence of the first page gave him less resistance than it had on previous mornings. This is automation beginning to take hold in the second stage. By the time he returned to me in April, he had completed 41 consecutive mornings of the reading practice, with an average session length that had grown from the minimum viable beginning of 5 minutes to an average of 38 minutes. He had read, in that 90-day period, 4 books directly relevant to commercial law. He had taken 4 pages of notes in the margin of each one. He had not become a disciplined man in the dramatic sense of that phrase. He had become a man whose subconscious had been shown sufficient evidence that morning reading was pattern rather than aberration. That is all. That is the entirety of the achievement. But that is also everything. At the age of 36, in 1926, Warren Aldrich left the typewriter repair trade and passed the Ohio bar examination. He had prepared for it in the mornings he had originally failed to begin. I received a letter from him in 1927 that contained one sentence I have since used in every lecture I have given on this subject. He wrote, "The morning I felt most incapable of beginning was the morning I was closest to no longer needing to force myself to begin. I simply did not know it. That is the law. That is how it operates. And it will operate for you in precisely the same way, because it is a law and not a favor, and laws do not play favorites." I want to close by returning to the claim with which I opened this address. I said, every man who has ever built anything of lasting value built it during a period when he felt wholly insufficient to the building of it. You have now seen the mechanism behind that claim. You have seen it in the cases of Warren Aldrich and Leonard Marsh. You have seen it in the principle of automation, in the law of the minimum viable beginning, in the mechanism of the identity statement, in the function of the log. You have seen the fear identified, the fear of criticism turning inward, and you have seen what it has already cost you in the days you did not begin. You have the formula. Most men and women who hear it will do nothing with it. This is not pessimism. It is the consistent finding of my 46 years of research. The majority will hear the law, understand it, agree with it, and return tomorrow morning to the same bed and the same reasonable voice and the same verdict of not yet. I am speaking now to the man who intends to be among the few. Here is your single instruction for tonight. Before you sleep, write the following in your own hand on paper with enough force that the pen marks the page beneath it as well. Write, I am building, name the specific practice. My minimum viable beginning is, name the specific minimum. I will begin tomorrow at, name the specific time. I will record the act within 1 minute of its completion. The man who builds this is not a different man from who I am right now. He is who I am after enough mornings of beginning. Read it aloud 3 times, then sleep. Tomorrow morning, when the weakness arrives, as it will arrive, you will not wait for it to pass. You will pick up the identity statement first. You will speak it aloud, and then you will begin the minimum viable beginning. That is all. The law will do the rest. You have paid long enough for not knowing it. Now you know it. The question, the only question, is what you intend to do with the knowing.